Hey, everybody. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Welcome to June. Gosh, can you believe it? It feels like it's just flying by. Maybe, hopefully, it feels that way for you. And maybe you've got some plans to get out of town before too long. Hey, listen, before we get underway, I've got a couple things to tell you. But before we do any of that, if you've been with us before, chances are you remember this. We're going to do this thing that we borrowed from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston, and that's her two-word check-in. So the idea is you're going to go into the chat. You're going to type your name, where you're coming in from, and then in 2 words, more if you need it, but 2 words is best. Brevity is our thing. 2 words, how are you doing right now? And we know for everybody it's a little bit different, but maybe you're getting ready to go on vacay. Maybe, like me, you've got a parent dealing with COVID. Not to worry, he's on Paxlovid, he's good. But a lot's going on in the world. So if you would, go ahead, name where you're coming in from, and then how you doing? Tired, Cameron, I hear you. I am hot, and I'm going to say excited. And I'm just across the river from you, Cameron. So everybody go ahead and toss your names in here. We got almost 700 people signed up for this, so there's quite a lot of us here. So you should see a lot of names go flying on by. If you see somebody you know, say hello. You can do that. And make sure you're talking to everybody. Hey, Susan, doing good. I see Hungry in there. Greg and Olympia. You guys are going too fast. Allison, Veronica, May, Kalia, Valentina, Avery, Claire, Jenna, Stephen. How you doing, buddy? Amy, Jocelyn. That's a pretty name. Diane, I probably messed it up. I'm sorry if I did. Ida, nice to see you, my friend down in Texas. Thinking of you. Jeremy, Carrie, who else? Whitney, lots of folks here. Marja, Andre, hey, buddy, I owe you an email. Missy, Karen, Dawn, Laura, Jennifer, Fabio, who else we got here? Barbara, I think if I pronounced that properly. Liz, who else we got? Stephanie, lots of folks. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for being with us. Keep going, gang. Go ahead and say hello to one another. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple pieces of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bill. And we are in for a treat. I've had a chance to preview this session, and it's just amazing. So first thing I need to tell you is this. Chances are you know it. Hopefully you're part of it. It's for network members. It's this thing that we started during the pandemic, and we're calling it Circles. And the idea behind it's pretty simple. We all need folks to lean on, right? We all need our kitchen cabinet of people we can go to when we've got a question, or maybe we need to celebrate something, whatever it might be. It's always good to come with a posse, right? So the Circles, the idea is we're connecting you to folks who share perhaps your identity. Maybe they do a similar sort of job, but in a different organization, or perhaps they're working on that same issue that you are. Great way for us. Networks are powerful, especially in terms of sharing resources and ideas. And so Circles are all about that, attaching you to the exact right people. It's kind of your network in the network. Mr. Kareem, if you would, who's helping me, by the way, on slides. Mr. K, if you would take us forward. It's the other thing, locals, they've been really active during the pandemic. I can't tell you how thrilling it's been for all of us at HQ and on the board to see folks showing up for one another virtually, except here's the thing. Just now, we're starting to see folks coming out. We know Chicago's already done this, but Kareem, if you'll take us forward, we have 2 events. Both of these are in person. So Washington, D.C. did a really cool thing last month, I believe it was. They went out and did a park cleanup. All these lovely faces are the people who organize and serve in leadership roles in the D.C. group. They're getting together for, I think, a happy hour. And so I believe it's going to be outdoors. So it'll be COVID safe, but suffice to say, you can find out more about that. Chances are Tristan has just put it into the chat for everybody. So that's fantastic. If you're in the DC area, don't need to be a network member to join us for these. It's all about building community for folks who work in foundation and nonprofit comms. So join us if you can. Probably be steamy because that's what DC does in the summer. Mr. K, if you will take us forward. Less steamy is Denver, I think. Actually, right about now, maybe not so much. But suffice to say, all these lovely faces, they're amazing people. You probably know a few of them if you live in the Metro Denver area, are helping to organize all the folks out in the Denver, Colorado area. And so they're getting together as well. Again, T is going to put something into the chat or just got there. So welcome you to do that if you're in the area. And then Mr. K, if you would take us forward, a couple of pieces of news around the conference. So the first headline for y'all is we're 60% sold out, which is crazy because we only just started telling you about the program the other day, including this little piece. If you've not read this book, it is absolutely incredible. President Obama had it on his list of favorite books, and it just got nominated. They made it into a Netflix mini series. I don't even know if we call these things that anymore, but suffice to say, they made it into a series of shows on Netflix. It's up for Emmys, and I think it's been up for a Golden Globe. Stephanie Land is absolutely incredible. Her story is incredibly powerful. Chances are you already know it. If not, check your email because we sent you a note about this just the other day, but she'll be with us. And then Mr. K, if you'll take us forward. We'll be telling you more about other folks who'll be keynoting and other folks speaking at the conference in the coming days. But for now, that's the first one we're going to reveal. Here's the other thing. The way we're organizing ourselves at the conference this year is really focused on the two ways we think you all want to learn. At least that's what you've told us. And that is you want to learn from experts, people who have deep knowledge and expertise, kind of like Bill, we're going to hear from in just a minute. And then sometimes we also want to learn from each other, right? So two ways to learn in Seattle. There's going to be a ton on offer. And of course, Seattle is an amazing city. So we hope you'll be able to be with us. I would say this, and I'm not trying to sell you anything, we're going to run out of seats. So if you're on the fence or you're thinking, man, this is something else on my to-do list, but I'll get to it later. Later may not be good enough because inevitably we have to fire up a wait list. We've had to do that every single year. And it looks like that's coming sooner rather than later. So if you're planning to be with us, we'd love to have you. Please do that sooner rather than later. And if you run into any issues, of course, just give me a shout. Mr. K, if you would take us forward. I think this next one is this, which is the main event and why we are here. Bill Shander is absolutely incredible. I've seen him present before. And in order for you to get that opportunity, I'm going to shut up and turn my camera off. But before I do and hand it to Bill, I just want to say thank you to Julie. You see her up there. She is valiantly trying to keep up with my motor mouth. She is offering ASL services. So if you have need, you can pin her up there, or you can also use the closed captioning, which we fired up for everybody for this session. So thank you to Julie. I will see you all on the other side. Final little reminder before Bill takes over. We will have Q&A, a 30-minute session on the other end of this. We call it office hours. So stick around. Kareem and Tristan will put a link in the chat. We'll all head over there and you'll have a chance to directly ask Bill questions, ideally on camera, however it works for you, but we'll see you then. In the meantime, Bill, off to you, sir.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much, Sean. I appreciate it. And normally I start off by apologizing in advance for speaking too quickly, but I clearly don't have to do that because Sean is just like I am. And I'm very excited to see that, yes, Julie has been able to keep, I assume she's been able to keep up. I don't actually read ASL, but yeah, so she seems to not be flustered, which is a really good sign. So I am here to talk about this topic from numbers to narrative. And you know, Sean actually mentioned it already. Brevity is the key. That's sort of like one quick little hint. I love the 2-question survey. I saw under-caffeinated and interested. So get yourself some caffeine if you need it. I also saw sweaty and curious as a pair of words, which, yeah, I assume sweaty because it's hot out. But regardless, even if it's because you just came in from a run, we're going to give you a good 45 minutes to an hour to cool off, not to mention the Q&A after that. So from numbers to narrative, why are we here to talk about that? I always like to start off with why, because there is a reason why this is powerful and important, really for everybody in the universe, but yeah, particularly for nonprofit, you know, foundation, communications, et cetera. And this is the reason why. In my world, this guy is very well known. In the broader universe, he's not as well known, but I bet in your group, I bet a lot of you recognize this person. So I'm going to start off just by playing a video. This is just going to be a 2-3 minute video. We'll watch it and then I'll talk about it very briefly.
The world my father told me about 50 years ago was a divided world. It looked like this. Each bubble is a country. Size is population. Blue, Africa. Red, Asia. Yellow, Europe. And green, the Americas. Vertical is child mortality. From 30% of children dying before the age of 5 down to almost 0 child death. Horizontal, number of babies born per woman, from 8 to less than 2. But most countries were up here. Women had 6 to 7 children. Child deaths were frequent. Almost every family lost 1 or more children. In many people's mind, the world still looks like this, developing and developed. But it's a myth, because the world has improved immensely in the last 50 years. Here we go. Year by year, child mortality fell in almost all countries. And as child mortality fell, women chose to have fewer and fewer babies. And that enabled them to invest more time and resources in each child. By 1990, some of the so-called developing countries had already made it down here. Some were in between. And a few remained up here with very high child mortality. Ethiopia had hardly moved at all. It had passed through decades of famines and political turmoil. Many people think that Ethiopia is still stuck up here. But look what happens after 1990. With improved access to health service in rural areas and well-spent aid, child mortality falls dramatically in Ethiopia. And with better access to family planning, women choose to have fewer and fewer babies. Ethiopia has come halfway and is moving quickly down to this corner. But Ethiopia still faces many challenges. I will split the Ethiopian bubble. The capital, Addis Ababa, is already down here. But the remote Somali region of Ethiopia still have high child mortality. But most of the regions, 90% of the population, are centered around the average. Most people think that the problems in Africa are unsolvable. But if the poorest countries can just follow the path of Ethiopia, it's fully possible that the world will look like this in 2030. Then there will be no countries left in the box we once called the developing world. But to ensure that that happens, we must measure the progress of countries. It's only by measuring we can cross the river of myths.
So that guy's name is Hans Rosling, and he passed away actually, I think about 3 years ago now. But he became very well known in my corner of the universe because of exactly that. He would take data, World Bank data and other sources, and tell these masterfully presented stories, usually using simple bubble charts like this one. But he doesn't just throw the data at you and hope you figure it out. He walks through it and he explains it. He did data storytelling with river rocks. He did data storytelling with plastic bins full of little, souvenirs from various places. Long story short, he was a master data storyteller. He was trained as a physician and a public health professional, but this is what he became famous for. Created a nonprofit called Gapminder, which was bought by Google, and he did it for a very, very, very long time. Long story short, why we are here is because we want to be more like Hans. We want to take data that may be very, very complex underneath it all and turn it into impactful stories that are going to really have an impact on an audience. So we're going to talk about how to do that. How do we get from numbers to narrative, from a pile of data to a visual narrative with impact? I'm going to tell it to you as a story in 5 parts. Part number 1 is about data literacy, okay, and analytics, but primarily in our context today, think of it as really data literacy. And so I love this quote: most of the world will make decisions by either guessing or using their gut. They'll be either lucky or wrong. That's a fact, right? If we make decisions based on our gut instinct, we're going to get it wrong at least half the time, right? Maybe if we're lucky, just with probabilities. But if we use data, of course, to make decisions, we're going to make better decisions. And there's a lot of caveats to that, which I was talking with Sean about earlier. But long story short, we know data drives better decisions. So being data literate is important. Data literacy is what? Data literacy is speaking the language of data, understanding data. Data literacy is what allows us to look at this image and realize that this is commentary. This is a joke, sort of. This is not just some ink marks on the page and a burnt match, right? This means something. This represents a chart. If you've never experienced data or data visualization, you would have no clue what this means. That's data literacy, okay? There was a study that was done, a survey, that found 24% of business decision makers consider themselves data literate. Now, it takes data literacy right now in this moment to really read this the right way, because the fact is that's the wrong number. The shocking number here is that 76% of business leaders do not consider themselves data literate. That is a mind blower, people, okay? So what do we mean by data literacy? There's a good definition of data literacy, it comes out of MIT, which is the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with data. That's great. Really what it comes down to is this. It's the ability to think about and do stuff with data. Let's simplify it, okay? So this is what you need in order to communicate with your data. Of course, it goes beyond that though. It's also about understanding your audience's data literacy, right? If you're scientists communicating very complex climate modeling to lay people, they're not going to get it. You have to express it in a simpler way based on your understanding of their data literacy. This is obvious. Most of us know this. You're all communications people. You get that. It also, data literacy means understanding what the numbers you're communicating really actually mean. So this website, dollarstreet.org, which by the way, Hans Rosling and his family created, so it's all tied together here, is about the idea that communicating numbers to people, the numbers on their own literally often mean nothing. What does it mean that when you look at how people, what their dental care regimen looks like based on their income level at different countries around the world, $27 in Burundi looks very different from $10,090 in Ukraine. Just in this very simple visual format, I get a sense of what those income levels actually mean. And in this website, you can click those drop downs and change all kinds of different things to really understand what does transportation look like at this income level versus this income level, et cetera. This is the meaning of the numbers. It's the raw values themselves. They don't mean anything. It's also data literacy about really understanding, do the numbers you're communicating even make sense? For example, this little comic strip. Yesterday, I had 0 spouses. Today, I have 1 spouse. Boy, by the end of the month, I'm going to have a lot of spouses, right? That's silly. Of course not. It just doesn't work that way. So it's about understanding those kinds of things. Data literacy at an organizational or even a society-wide level, if we were ever to really get there, is also about the democratization and ubiquity of access to data and the tools to work with that data. Long story short, this is the most important thing. It's about thinking critically about our data. It's not about opening up a spreadsheet and looking at a bunch of numbers. It's about understanding what those numbers mean in all the ways that I've already talked about. It's about everybody having access to data. It's about everybody having the level of skills and understanding to be able to understand what that data means. And obviously, some people need more than others, but this is what is really required to really communicate your data to your audience. And again, it's all about them. So, part 1, data literacy, extremely important. And I would argue most of us, particularly in communications, our data literacy is not where it needs to be. So it doesn't mean you have to go out and become, a master's in data analytics. Doesn't mean you need to go study statistics, but just try to up your game a tiny little bit. Take some intro to data analytics classes, and you'll be better at the data literacy stuff. Really just how to think about data and do stuff with. Okay, now part 2, storytelling. You're all communicators. You all get storytelling. It's important. Just as a quick little reminder, why is storytelling so important? This is why. The example that I like to share, when ancient man went out on the hunt and they got the buffalo, they came back to the village and they explained to their friends and peers and family members how to hunt buffalo with data, okay? But it wasn't in a spreadsheet, all right? But they explained it in the form of a story. So, but the data was there, right? They had the number of miles they had to run, the wind speed, the wind direction, how many arrows they left with, how many arrows they used, how many buffalo there were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that data in the form of story. There are a lot of people who've made a very compelling case that storytelling is the most important evolutionary imperative that humans have, meaning I require story to survive. It is literally how I really learn how to do stuff that lets me run away from lions in the savannah and or hunt and get buffalo so I can eat tomorrow, okay? So that is why storytelling. How? I like to talk about it sort of in 2 key contexts. Number 1, the most important thing you need to do, whether it's data-driven storytelling or otherwise, but here I'm talking about data, is you have to focus. And there are 3 things you must focus in on. I have 3 terrible acronyms. Here's the first one. You can see it's a terrible acronym, but luckily they have a good shorthand, the QUIs, okay? Rhymes with Y, it's nice. The QUIs are terrible though, all right? So here's the first one. The pronunciation for this terrible acronym is quietus, all right? So again, apologies, it's a bad acronym, but these are 3 of the most important ideas I will share with you today. The first one is pretty straightforward. Quietus stands for know what your data is saying. That's what I was just talking about. That's data literacy. You have to understand your data in order to communicate your data. Duh, straightforward, let's move on. That's just a given, okay? Second terrible acronym. I do this presentation and or I do workshops for a lot of different types of folks. When it's communications people, you're the ones who understand this the best. You live in this world, Quianth. Quianth stands for know what your audience needs to hear. It's all about them. We know that. I don't need to tell you that, but it's sort of worth reminding ourselves, especially with such an adorable video as this one, that audiences are weird. Even when you think you understand your audience, they can surprise you. So for instance, how would you design an ice cream cone if you knew your audience was going to eat the ice cream cone with their toes, right? It might change your approach to what you're doing. Now, and particularly with data communications, because it's this abstract, weird thing that freaks people out, data, you have to really talk to your audience, really understand not just, hey, how do you like your numbers? That's a silly question. No. What are you going to do with these numbers? What is the plan? What is the objective? What tasks are you trying to actually do with those numbers? So you have to go a little bit deeper than you normally do when communicating other things other than numbers. Okay, third acronym, last one. This one is terrible, okay? It's the worst of the three in that you don't even know how to pronounce it when you look at it. There is a pronunciation, Querwitz, okay? This one, they're all equally as important. These are truly three legs of a stool. If any one of them is missed, the stool falls over, right? But this is the one that people forget about most frequently. At one end of the spectrum, communications people, you know this, but you forget about it when you're working with data sometimes because, and this is not to stereotype or overgeneralize, but a lot of communications people are intimidated by numbers. They don't feel comfortable with the numbers. They're afraid that they don't know what they're doing. Therefore, they get so freaked out, they forget this part. At the other end of the spectrum, you have data scientists. They're so obsessed with the numbers, so focused on the numbers, that sometimes they don't even think about this one. Same problem for different reasons, but in the end, it's all about this, Querwitz. In order to communicate anything to anybody, including data, you have to know what you really want to say. This is obvious, right? This is, of course, you have to know what you're saying to say something, but people skip this part. And I'm not talking about manipulating my audience. I'm not talking about fudging the numbers to say what I want to say and not ignoring the truth, right? Because again, quibus, I have to know what my data is saying. I have to know what I want to say about it though. I have a point of view. I'm going to hone in on this part of the story because this is the part that's important for you. All right, back to the audience again, the three quis. My audience, what do you need to hear? By the way, need is the most important word there for the quianth one. It's not what you asked me for. It's not what you want. It's what you actually need. That is my mission. I call myself a data fiduciary. My primary responsibility is to the truth in the data. I'm also very loyal to my audience and their actual needs, but I do have a point of view, so I'm going to focus on Querwitz as well. If you don't think about what you're trying to say, really, if you miss any one of these three things, this is what your audience looks like, right? They will be confused, annoyed, distracted, questioning your credibility, okay? So you have to get these three things right. If you nail them, if you really think them through, then they will guide every single decision you make from here forward. Not that this is a purely linear process from numbers to narrative, but we can think about it as a linear process. And if you get those first three things right, you're really in much, much, much better shape. All right. Now, how do we do it? Once I've gotten my focal points down, my three quis, how do you actually get to a narrative that has an impact? Well, we have to define story. Excuse my bouncing icon there. We have to define story in order to think about how we're going to get to story. And so I have a very, 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 very simple definition for story. Okay. Stories are linear experiences, first of all. You start over here, and somehow, whatever way you progress to over here. I was an English major, by the way, in college, and I learned all kinds of useless, but interesting things about stories, the story arc, protagonist, plot, etc., all kinds of things. None of that matters. My simple definition, two parts. Number one, stories are linear, okay? The second part is that stories flow. I am not here to even define what I mean by flow. You know flow. Why? Because you have 50,000 years of evolution that has taught you what a story looks, sounds, and feels like. Your ear knows the difference between a story and a random collection of facts, right? That's flow. This flows to this, flows to this. This is all we need to know to think about when it comes to storytelling, within our context, data storytelling in particular. So what I teach, the way to get to a narrative structure that's going to hold your story and perform well, is as simple as outline your story, meaning I have a bunch of different sections of content. I'm going to put my buckets in order because I got to put them in order, right? It's a linear experience. And I'm going to label each bucket of content with 1 or 2 words. So for instance, Hans Rosling's story that we just listened to before, he talked about 4 key ideas there. He talked about Ethiopia for a little while. He talked about how things used to look one way, they look a different way now. He talked about how that changed over time. And he mentioned how in the future it might look like this. But that's not the order, right? The order was the world used to be like this. Over time, it changed. Ethiopia is an example of that change. And by the way, if it keeps going that way, it's going to look like this in the future. Those are the 4 sections, right? That's an outline. Now I can attach content to those 4 pieces. You all know this, you're communications people. The second part that I talk about is the flow part. And this is the magic lesson that I have to share with you, which is not rocket science at all, but is 100% guaranteed to make you confident that your story is actually a story. And that's simply to tell your story in words. Now, again, communications people, you're kind of used to doing things like this, right? But people forget to do it, especially with data. Again, just like the quays, why do we skip Querwitz? Because we're freaked out because it's numbers. Oh my God, it's numbers. I got to put the numbers on the slide and run away quickly, right? No. Forget about the numbers. When you're in storytelling mode, when you're in this phase, step back from the data, don't worry, and just ask yourself, well, what am I really trying to say about this data right now? What is the flow of the ideas? And so I'm gonna do what I'm recommending here, which is I'm gonna tell the abbreviated version of Hans Rosling's full story in words. Now, if I had an hour-long presentation, that doesn't mean write the entire hour-long presentation. You're gonna have to do that eventually. But what I'm talking about here is thinking through the 2-minute version of that hour-long presentation. The only purpose of this step is to confirm that the story flows. So let's try it with Hans Rosling's story. Here we go. The world used to be a divided world between rich and poor, developed and developing countries, especially by these 2 metrics, child mortality and fertility rate. But over time, that changed. Countries started improving by these 2 metrics and made a lot of progress. Ethiopia is an example of one of those countries that made a ton of progress. The vast majority of their population is already halfway in between the old poor country view and the new rich country view. Addis Ababa, the capital, is already looking like one of the richest countries in the world by these 2 measures. If things keep going the way they've been going for the last X number of years, by 2030, there'll be no longer any countries stuck in the upper right-hand corner of that chart. Boom, that's the story. That was an awesome story, right? It flowed. One of the keys is to figure out how you're going to make a transition from what sound like 2 unrelated ideas, like I'm talking about how things changed over time, and suddenly I'm talking about Ethiopia. Like, where did that come from? That was such a non sequitur, right? Well, if you just think through those transitions, it's that simple. That's flow. You know this. So this is the technique, especially with data, to make sure you have a linear experience that actually flows. Then you can worry about what goes on your actual slides, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is the idea. Data stories are stories. Yeah, data is an ingredient. It's maybe the most important ingredient, but they're stories. So step back from your data, focus on the story at this phase, worry about the data again when it comes to actually putting the content together in detailed form. All right, part 3 in my story with you all is about design thinking. So my data literacy is on track, my quays are nailed, and I've outlined my story and I know it's gonna flow. I gotta think now about how I'm gonna put those visuals together. How am I gonna really bring all those slides together? Design thinking is a school of thought. It's a process. It's a way of approaching design, whether it's product design, graphic design, any kind of design. And it comes out at Stanford. And the basic idea is this. There's a process of steps to follow. The first one is about empathy. This is all, again, sort of circling back to like the quays. It's about having empathy for your audience. So even once I've gone through that process of thinking through my story and I'm about to think about specific visuals I'm going to create, I have to circle back to my audience and really think about them, having empathy for them. What tools are they going to use? Are they looking at this thing on a phone? Am I presenting it live in person, et cetera, et cetera? With deep empathy for who they are and what they're trying to do with the data, then I can move on to defining my solution, right? This is like requirements and steps like that, really thinking through a definition of what I'm actually trying to create. After I've defined it, Then I can ideate on it, brainstorm how I'm going to approach that problem. After which I can then actually prototype. I can actually test something very quickly. Silicon Valley loves to say, fail quickly, try again, try again, try again. Eventually you get it right. That's what design thinking is about. Empathy, define, brainstorm or ideate, and then prototype and test. In order to actually fail quickly and actually have it turn into something successful, you have to test it. So when I'm doing data storytelling, not only do I think through those things that I described, a nice outline that flows, as I'm starting to think about my visuals, I'm sketching ideas very, very, very quickly, and I'm showing them to my clients or to my audience, whoever they are, and saying, what do you think about something like this? And these are low fidelity, rough prototypes, literally hand-drawn sketches, and I'm a terrible drawer. I can't even draw a straight line, okay? And I test it though. I say, if you look at this, do you think you can do what you need to do with this data? Yes or no? If no, I keep going back to it. But this is what it's all about. What design thinking, the entire basis for it, is essentially the same word I keep saying. Why? Why are we here today? Why am I telling this story? What am I trying to focus in on? What is the point? What do you need to do with this data? If you constantly circle back to ask yourself, why, or why, right? Everything gets better. This literally drives every decision, and you have to do it in multiple steps. That's why I have this as a separate part of the story, even though I kind of just talked about it. And by the way, I'm about to talk about design and visualization best practices, which is very closely related to this. But this deserves its own moment. Constantly ask yourself why. And again, this is something people totally ignore in data storytelling. Hey, I got a bunch of data, did a survey, I'm putting this report together, whatever it is. I get to the slide creation mode, and what do? Crank out some charts, baby, and throw them on some slides, and I'm done, right? It's like checking a box. No, you're doing it for a reason. That slide exists to influence somebody, to explain, to educate, whatever it is. Why? What are you really trying to accomplish? Think critically about that. I know that's obvious, but boy, people don't do it, especially with data for whatever reason. For two ends of the spectrum reasons, like I described before. Okay. Part number 4. I'm going to share with you some very basic information about design and data visualization best practices. Even this very brief webinar, though, will leave you with something that you will remember, guaranteed, and it's going to make you a better creator of visuals. And by the way, I know most of you, maybe all of you, aren't really creating the visuals, right? You have people who you are hiring, whether it's contractors or employees, whoever, who are really doing the hands-on creation of this stuff. That's okay. You're managing it. You're worrying about it. You need to comment on it, et cetera, et cetera. So knowing this stuff is going to make you a better leader of people doing this, even if you're not hands-on doing it yourself. Okay. Number one thing I want to say about design is this. All of design, what you are doing when you design any visual, anything, you are constantly communicating information hierarchy. It's almost the goal of graphic design to communicate information hierarchy. In other words, this is more important and this is less important, okay? Which is driven by what again? Oh, right, the whys, right? You know what you want to say. You know what's the key insight in the data is. You know what your audience needs to do with it. That's your hierarchy of importance. So that's what design is doing, communicating that hierarchy by the placement of stuff on a page or the screen. Stuff at the top is more important than stuff at the bottom. Stuff in the middle is more important than stuff on the edges, et cetera. It's also the size. Big stuff is more important than tiny stuff. We know this. It's also color. Everything is a washed out, faded back shade of gray, except for, boom, a bright yellow, right? Look here. Color communicates hierarchy. And finally, typography, which is an intimidating word for non-designers. All I mean in our context is giant type is important, tiny type is not important. We know this, move on. But here's the new concept, probably none of you have been exposed to. I don't know if they even teach this really in design school, never mind in just communications generally. The way I can create a visual most effectively, understanding I'm communicating information hierarchy, is for me to understand how your brain is likely to process that visual. This is how it's going to happen. You're all humans, right? Every human being on Earth responds to every visual experience that we have in what's called a pre-attentive way, meaning before you're even paying attention. So in other words, it's very fast and it's subconscious. Every visual experience. So when you all logged into this webinar, you got into Zoom, you saw a couple faces, right? You saw a big slide or a video playing. And like instantaneously, in a tenth of a second, you had a sense of what occupied the most space. Information hierarchy, by the way. How many people there were in the room. Maybe you looked at the chat and you saw a whole bunch of names down there. Very quick subconscious response to how crowded the space was. If it was a physical room, you'd have a sense of how crowded it was, how much room there was, where was the space you could walk to if you're an introvert, etc. Long story short, subconscious, very, very fast. Okay, why should I care? Well, here's a sort of good demonstration of it, which might help indicate why we should care in this context. I'm going to show you an image very quickly. I want you to, and I'm going to do so fast, you're going to have a pre-attentive response. I'm not going to allow you to have an attentive response, a thoughtful response. Ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1. There it is. What'd you see? It's a jumble of lines. I had no insight in a pre-attentive way to what was going on there. Now, I'm going to do it again. And now I'm going to apply some design to the image. And let's see if your pre-attentive response is faster, or not faster, maybe more effective, more honed in on something meaningful. Okay, ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1. There it is. What did you see? Right? Design used thoughtfully can trigger a pre-attentive response, can help you see what I need you to see. Is all the data still there? Yes, it is. It's all there for context. I could certainly have removed all the gray lines too, but I wanted you to see the context, but I really want you to see that in that particular data point, it's going up over time, right? Whatever the story is. Design to trigger a pre-attentive response based on, oh yeah, there go my quays again, right? Information hierarchy, but I'm thoughtful about your pre-attentive response. Now, as a teacher of this stuff, I always like to try to think of, well, how can I translate that into lessons, right? And there are all kinds of lessons. By the way, there's a lot of nuance around the pre-attentive response, pre-attentive triggers, how human beings respond to things like movement versus things like just positional differences in a static page versus things like color variation versus things like contrast variation versus differences like shapes, circles versus squares, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of science around this. And there is a hierarchy of strength of these different pre-attentive triggers. I'm not going to get into that today. This is just a short webinar, but this is my design advice boiled down to 2 words based on my understanding of a pre-attentive response. If you simply do less in your visuals, or again, in your case, get your designers to do less, to simplify, to reduce contrast, color, distraction, nonsense, generally speaking, and use color, contrast, whatever, to let that one thing pop based on your quays, your audience is more likely to have a pre-attentive, subconscious response that guides them to the answer. This is not to say that every visual must be understandable at a glance. Some visuals can be very complex. I may have to spend 20 minutes to really consume a visual sometimes, but I'm still going to design that visual as best I can to trigger a glance-based pre-attentive response to help make sure you're looking in the right spots to find the stuff you need to find, even if it takes 20 minutes to do it. So do less in your design, simplify the visual approach, even if you have complexity. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a visual. This is a real chart that a real client of mine shared with me. And I'm going to walk through this, and I'm going to change it step by step, piece by piece, thinking of my audience's pre-attentive response to try to make this into a visual that actually communicates what the client wanted to communicate, what they wanted people to be able to do with this data. First of all, let me explain the data. And actually, even before let me explain the data, let me propose or sort of throw out there a little, I guess, a thought experiment. If you look at this and you ask yourself, if I were to glance at this, what would my pre-attentive response be? So if you all think about it for a second, and I know it's a webinar, so I can't ask you to answer, but think about your pre-attentive response to this. And I do this in workshops, when I teach workshops, I show this, and usually people will say, well, my pre-attentive response is recoil. I saw that. That was a good comment. Some people also look at this and say, well, the first thing I notice is the bars. What happened in January? Fine. Some people say, well, the lines, the colorful lines, I see that first. That jumps out at me. Some people say the dotted lines, the actual benchmark lines, jump out at me. So in other words, we're already arguing about what the pre-attentive response is. That's probably not good news, right? If I am a designer with solid quays, I should be letting my design guide you to what I want you to see. If I'm having you fight yourself over it, not a good start, okay? So, all right, let me explain what the data is. What we have here is three key things. The bars show the user volume for a software application, the number of people using this software. Okay. The lines show the error rate, the percentage of people hitting an error when using this software. Okay. And the two colors are the old technology and the new technology. Okay. The dotted lines are the benchmarks. We want to be below there. Okay, so we want to have a lower error rate than 3.5% for the yellow one and 2.5% for the green ones. That's the basic idea. That's what the data is. Now, let us critique this thing after we recoil in horror. Let us ask ourselves, why are we recoiling? And the first question I usually ask in a situation like this is I ask myself, like what specific changes could I make? I might ask myself, what do I think about all the numbers? Do I like labeling all the data points? And by the way, before I answer that, I have to say, if it were up to me, what I would do is I would arm you all with a new key for your keyboard, because I'm saying do less, that's my design advice, but really I would love to give you like the 14 or the 27 suggested changes you would make to graphics in specific terms. But even better than that would be if you had a magic new key on your keyboard that you could just hit, that every time you hit, say, gee, I wonder what's going on with this one, hit that key and it would magically fix it in the spirit of do less. I can't do that, but I can arm you with questions to think about and thoughts to have about how to change, make fixes for things like this. So the first question is, do I think that labeling every data point is a good idea? I'm gonna hit my magic F key, which by the way is called an F no key, okay? Because the answer to that question is F no. I don't think labeling my data points is a good idea. So no, what I recommend to you is this. By default, in the spirit of do less, the answer is don't label your data points. In fact, I say label none of them by default. My goal here is to change your default position to no instead of yes. Now, you can talk me into adding a data label back in. Sure, tell me why I should label that one dot for October. Talk me into it. Not the other way around. I'm going to start from a position of no. You got to work to make me add it back. I'll do it if you talk me into it. Okay, so default to no. All right, next change. I look at this and I say, what do I think about my vertical axes? First of all, why do I have to crane my neck 90 degrees to read it? That's annoying. Second of all, do I need to know exactly where 1.1 million is, or where 2.0 or 1.5 exactly percent is? I say to that, same darn thing, no. By default, the answer remains no. By default, give me the bottom number and the top number and nothing else. Truly, nothing else, bottom, top. Now, if I have negative and positive numbers, you should also label the 0 line, yes. If it's really important, again, talk me into it. I need to see where 2.5% is, great, show me 2.5. But you got to talk me into it, not the other way around. And by the way, look at these labels. Percent of users receiving errors, parentheses, lines. Seriously? How about just error percentage lines, right? Like, come on, I think we can simplify these things, which gives us room to put them horizontally. Yeah, you have to do it manually because Excel won't do this by default, but blah, 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 you all get it. This is a lot easier to look at. Yeah, delete it all, baby, 100%. So yes, default to no. Now, I look at this thing now and I say, Whew, yeah, you know what? The gray bars, because you may have noticed I took away the grid lines too. No, thank you. I don't need those grid lines. Generally, talk me into it. I can be talked into it, but generally, no. As few of them as possible if I have to have them, as light gray as possible if I have to have them. In this case, I could just put a nice light gray box so I can define the space of the chart in the background, which means I had to make my gray bars slightly darker. Now they're even higher contrast. Now I'm having definitely a triggered response to those bars. And I might ask myself, what's going on with those bars? Do I need the bars? And I ask the client, hey, user volume seems to be going up, but the error rate is going down. Does user volume have anything to do with the error rate? And they said, actually, Bill, good point. F no to those too. This story had nothing to do with the user volume. They didn't even care about user volume. This story is all about the error rate. So why are we talking about it? Thank you very much. Goodbye. Okay. Now I look at this visual and I say, okay, we're at least down to two things that we can worry about, the pre-attentive response. I personally think the strongest pre-attentive trigger now is those thick dotted lines. Let me ask you a question. I think you can probably guess the answer. Is the benchmark in any chart the target, the most important thing in a chart, or is it the data itself? You know the answer. No. The benchmark should not be the thick, meaty, heaviest thing in the visual. It should be the data. The data is the star of every chart. So let's simplify that design, make them much thinner, maybe even lighter if you wanted to, whatever. Now I look at this thing, and what do you think that drives me crazy at this point? Do I think that all the dots on the lines are a good idea? Absolutely not. Do not put markers on your line charts. They serve zero purpose. Now you could say, but Bill, how would I know the March data point is? It's a flat line without that dot. Well, who cares where the March data point is? I see where it is generally-ish, right? I also made the lines a little bit thicker so they pop out a little bit more. Okay, now I look at this chart and I say, all right, client, tell me something. Is it important to track the old versus the new technology, the gold and the green? Because if so, this chart's a decent chart. It's helping me track those two lines. That's one a good pre-attentive trigger is called parallelism. We're good at detecting parallel lines. I asked the client that, and you know what they said? Oh, actually, no. We don't care to compare the old and new technologies. Thank you very much. Why are they on top of each other? It's really hard to see the point of the data. The point is actually, where did it cross the benchmark? How long ago and by how much? You can't see that here. I can see it here though. Nothing wrong with putting a bunch of small charts next to each other. This is called small multiples. Please do that. This works very, very well. Now, I look at this chart and I ask the client, so we're looking at this chart. It's all about how long ago I passed the benchmark and by how much. So in other words, ooh, this is interesting. This is the rare occasion where the data is actually not the star of the chart. It's not the line. It's actually this. It's the space in between. This is a different chart type. It's not a line chart. This is what's called a deviating area chart. It's about emphasizing the space in between, that deviation, that size, that area of that space. That's why changing the chart type made sense. Now, I asked the client, hey, you know, a couple seconds ago, we were talking about comparing things. This still allows me to compare the old technology and the new technology. Do I care about comparing them at all? I know we didn't care about tracking them at the same time, like the angle of the lines, but what about this? And they said, oh, good point, good question. Actually, no. We disbanded the old technology team. They're not even fixing bugs anymore. Why are we talking about it? Absolutely not. Let's move on. Now I look at the chart and I say, okay, by the way, I've gotten rid of 2/3 of my data, but this is actually telling a story that was the focal point of this chart. But I look at this chart, especially now it's all stretched out and bigger, and I say, that scale looks weird. Why do I have such a weird scale? Let's actually, spread that data out so I can actually see what's going on. We could have a whole long conversation about scales and whether you're manipulating your audience if you stretch them out or squish them. You can lie with data by doing that, but I'm doing that in an honest, fair way here. That was the right choice, which, by the way, I'm starting to get into changes that really aren't do less. They're really not F no anymore. I'm starting to lean a little bit into F yes, right? For instance, what about annotations? Something important happened here. Big arrow and nice text annotation. Inline labeling. Look at my legend is gone. I don't have to now like bob for apples or look like I'm watching a tennis match to figure out what the colors mean, because the inline labeling, very effective, shown by research. This chart is now the chart that told the story that this client needed to tell in the meetings, in the context that this data was being shared. End of discussion. The original chart was a disaster. This chart does what it's meant to do. Almost all of those changes in the spirit of doing less, with a couple of exceptions. But very importantly, like I said before, not every visual can be understood at a glance. And sometimes, even though a visual might be understandable at a glance, that doesn't mean you can't show more data. So let me explain. Let's say I did a survey. I asked 1,000 people to rate a product on a scale from 1 to 5. The median was 3.8. Fine. Mildly interesting. People kind of like the product. Okay. But what if this is what it looked like? 500 people, 400 people love that product. Everybody else, median score 3.8. Or what if it looked like this? 400 people hate that product. Everybody else, same median score. This is meaningful. This is nuanced. This version of it doesn't tell me enough. In some cases it might, but for my story, I need you to understand people love or hate the product, but decent median score. For a more complex story, I'm going to show it like this, but look at the design. Do less. Simplified visual design, bold annotation, but I'm showing you the data. I'm allowing you to see all those data points because the nuance of that story will come through in that way. You don't have to dumb it down completely for your audience. Now, very importantly, last bit about design and visualization here. This is mission critical. And this is stuff that people are not taught about in school. Just about anybody, even data analytics people aren't really taught this for the most part. It's also about the charts that you choose. How do we pick charts? We pick charts because we open up Excel, I have data, and I see the buttons that aren't grayed out. So I click on them and I generate charts and sure, that's a bar chart. I know what that thing is. PowerPoint, move on with my life, right? That is the worst way to pick a chart because you know what? Different charts do different things. Different charts are optimized to solve different problems, to enable different tasks. Okay, well, how do I learn how to pick the right chart? Boom. There are cheat sheets like the visual vocabulary produced by, in this case, the Financial Times, broken up by category. If I really need you to understand how things have changed over time, there's that green column in the middle. Those are visuals I should be using. Does anybody see a pie chart there? No, you do not. Do not use a pie chart to communicate change over time. Pie charts are in the part to whole relationship because they're fine. They're okay at certain things. They're terrible at other things. We don't even have to argue about pie charts, but I don't see them in most of the other columns here. Look at the far left, deviation. That third one there, the deviating area chart, that chart is for showing what I showed. It is not going to do a lot of other tasks. And that's the other key word here. It's about the category, correlation, distribution, etc. But it's also about the task. If I'm showing you magnitude stuff, the purple column, it's probably because I think your task is to compare the values to each other. Bar charts are tailor-made for comparing distinct values. Again, no pie charts over there because you know what is terrible for comparing values? Pie charts. So use a cheat sheet like this one, pick the right chart for the job, and you'll do a better job having an impact on your audience. And this is what it's all about for chart selection, but really for everything we've talked about today. If you forgot every word that I said today, but you simply walked away from today and you said, gee, when I'm making my next slide presentation or report, maybe I should actually have an intentional reason for my decisions. If you just did that, everything you make will be better. Intentional about the chart you choose, the colors that you choose, the level of contrast, even what goes on the axes of your chart. Am I using the real values or turning into a rate, doing a per capita, a median age? These decisions, if you make them thoughtfully, will make your reports, your presentations more impactful. End of discussion. All right, part 5. I know we're running late here. Let me just very quickly show you an example or two. The Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals from the World Bank is a great collection of data stories for all of the SDGs. I've clicked already here into the third one here, global health amid a pandemic. I like showing these for a couple of reasons. One, these data stories, they're very like journalistically created. They're like, paragraphs of text, then visuals and paragraphs of text. It feels like you're reading like the New York Times or whatever. But they're very thoughtfully outlined, and they clearly flow. These ideas connect together because they've thought this stuff through. So first bucket of content for this one, local health risks can become global health risks. And then it's a story about where these things come from, and nice use of a map in this case to show that there's a geographic component to zoonosis events. As I go through this thing, I get interesting visuals that are really thoughtfully chosen to communicate the data. In this case, nurses and physicians per 1,000 people. Low-income countries, the distribution of this number is much, much, much lower, with one pretty extreme exception. In high-income countries, there's a pretty broad range of values, from very high to pretty surprisingly low, but a pretty broad range, and obviously a much higher median value. This is the right visual for the job at hand. By the way, when they're asking their audience to perform a similar task, they're going to repeat the same visual. Very important. Yes, keep things fresh and interesting for your audience, but repeat visuals if you have a repeating task. Otherwise, you confuse them. They're going to be focused on the chart rather than actually solving the problem at hand. Long story short, this visual story is full of great data visualizations. It's very well structured, really creative use of different visualization types, including a visual that when you first look at it, you may say, oh my goodness, what is going on there? Holy moly, holy cannoli, we were talking about that earlier. But the fact is, this is called a matrix heat map, or my friend Steve Wexler said, some people call these highlight tables, like if you do conditional formatting in Excel. My friend Steve Wexler calls this the gateway drug to data visualization, because it's just like Excel cells using color to highlight different trends, and look at how powerful these are. I've got thousands of data points here, but I can hone in on a single number if I want to. I can scan a column and see the story. I can step back and see the big picture story that the upper right-hand corner is way darker than the lower left-hand corner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, great ability to see detail without sacrificing the ability to see the big picture. Check out that Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals, all of the data stories. It's like a master class in data storytelling and data visualization, all in one location. Last but not least, The Economist created this data story, one of my favorites of all time, looking at the murder rate in Honduras. You're supposed to tack this up on a wall, throw a dart at it, and your odds of being murdered if you were a man in Honduras in 2012 were the same as the odds of hitting this square right here, compared to the United States, Singapore. Now, 1 in 599 compared to 1 in 13,000. I get it. I get big number, small number. Okay. But wow, people are terrible at probabilities. I can easily imagine hitting this by accident, where there is zero chance on Earth that I will ever hit the Singapore square. I will never be murdered in Singapore. End of discussion. Very powerful data storytelling and data visualization. Do you need to be a master designer to create this? Could all of you create this in PowerPoint? Yeah, I think you could. This is about data literacy. This is about thoughtful approach to how I'm going to communicate, what's really important to communicate, my audience's needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the stuff I've talked about. And then it's a couple squares. Come on. So the execution on these ideas, if you get the ideas right, can and should be the easy part. That's all I got. Thank you all very, very much. I do look forward to answering your questions during the Q&A, the office hours that we're going to do after this. And yeah, thank you, of course, Sean and everybody, for having me present.